Okay, well, thank you for watching another video with the Anselm Institute. My name is Michael, and I'm with my very good friend Ryan, and we're going to be talking today about a Spanish Dominican named Ramirez that Ryan has spent a ton of time with. We're also going to be talking about modern moral theology, modern moral thought, and Ryan and I have been friends for 20 years since our undergraduate work. Very good friends. He's one of my dearest friends. And anytime I have ethical questions personally or about principles in ethics, I call Ryan. So he has just spent an enormous amount of time research in this area and philosophy in general, modern analytic philosophy. And then he may cover this some too, but St. Thomas in particular, and then the Thomistic tradition broadly as well, including modern moral theology and that. So what we're going to talk about today is basically the state, a little bit about modern moral theology, and some in particular about a Spanish Dominican named Ramirez. And Ryan, we've talked a little bit about Ramirez recently, and I don't know if I've asked it in specifically this form, but I think I kind of have an idea because we were talking some about this before. But how did you in particular get into Ramirez? And then you in that there's a link between kind of the state of modern moral theology. What's the importance of Ramirez? Just a few questions along those lines. And feel free to take them in whatever order is best.
Yeah, thank you. So Ramirez is an interesting figure. His name is Santiago Ramirez. You can find the majority of his works on archive.org under J.M. Ramirez. He was a Spanish Dominican, died in 1967. He was a Peritus at Vatican II. It was an expert on the theological commission there. He was a moral theologian at the University of Freiburg for about 25 years. Freiburg is kind of the powerhouse Dominican. It's always been the powerhouse Dominican moral theology graduate school, essentially. And he was there. The thing about Ramirez, the reason he's so little known today is basically two reasons, and I'll say how I kind of got into him. He's so little known because all of his work is in Latin. He wrote throughout the 20th century, and he wrote in the Old Way, which is extensive, detailed commentaries on St. Thomas's works in Latin. And his works were being published in a collected volumes, Opera Omnia, by his friends. And they completed that publication project in the early 90s, all in Latin. And so all those works are out of print. They're hard to obtain. Some of those works are available on archive.org. So it's one reason why he's so little known, because he wrote in Latin. Another reason he's so little known is because he was a scholastic philosopher and theologian of the highest order. And that means that the majority of his works use the scholastic vocabulary, terminology, different types of argumentation, different type of demonstrations, what are called propter quid demonstrations. And he'll tell you this is a propter quid demonstration, this is a quia demonstration. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, a propter quid demonstration is an explanation of why something is the case. It's a demonstration of it. A quia demonstration is a proof of the fact of something. So a quia demonstration proves that something is the case. A propter quid demonstration proves why it is the case. And he goes through St. Thomas's works and lays bare St. Thomas's argumentation, picks up the commentary tradition and the previous 800 years. I mean, it's incredible work. He has, for example, what is probably the finest work ever in any language covering the question of the purpose of life. It's a 5-volume commentary, about 3,500 pages, all in Latin, on the first 5 questions of the second part of the Summa. The first part of the second part, the treatise on beatitude, or the treatise on happiness, we would say. And that work is one of the reasons why people who know he's considered to be one of the greatest Thomists of the 20th century. But nobody knows about him.
I was going to mention something there. You said before he was influential on some of the great Thomists of the 20th century, including, I think you said, Garrigou Lagrange. Is that correct?
I don't know. I don't know whether he was influential on Garrigou Lagrange. They were contemporaries. He was influential on Ralph MacInerny, who was a great Thomist at Notre Dame. They sparred on the doctrine of analogy. MacInerny thought that Ramirez's doctrine of analogy was totally misconceived and misunderstood, but MacInerny had a great respect for Ramirez's encyclopedic learning, basically, on the doctrine of analogy. And in his collected works, Ramirez has a 4-volume work, which is about 2,000 pages, on analogy. It's called De Analogia. 3 of the 4 volumes are available on archive.org, and he covers everything you want to know about analogy from a philosophical perspective, from a theological perspective, from a historical perspective. It's just comprehensive, and that's what he was known for, is doing that. The other person he had a great influence on is a guy named William Wallace, who was also Dominican, who died, I want to say, about 15 years ago. He was a giant, intellectual, scholarly giant. He had master's degrees, I believe 2 master's degrees, I think 1 in engineering, 1 in chemistry. He was in the Navy during World War II. When he got out, he became a Dominican. And he got 2 earned doctorates, 1 in dogmatic theology and 1 in moral theology from the University of Freiburg, where he was a student of Ramirez. Later in his life, he joined the Albertus Magnus Lyceum and joined he was part of the kind of what are called the River Forest Thomists, and did a bunch of work in that, did a bunch of work recovering the real dispute between Galileo and the church by translating Galileo's journals. And he was an expert in formal and material logic and science and moral theology. And he spent about 15 years as the head of Leonine Institute, which is the organization that I believe is continuing to publish the critical edition of all of St. Thomas's works. So it was a giant. In William Wallace's doctoral dissertation in moral theology, which I have here, this is available on archive.org also, the role of demonstration in moral theology. And he talks about Santiago Ramirez's incredible influence on him as a student, and also in terms of his method. And basically, he says the whole thing. He says the title of this work shows the influence of Ramirez's resolution of the methodological problem of moral theology. Ramirez wrote in the first volume of his treatise on human happiness, there's about 150 pages that are generally considered to be one of the greatest statements of what moral theology is, what its sources are, and what its method is that's ever been written. It's all locked in Latin, and most people have never heard of this stuff. And it's a shame. So that's Ramirez broadly. And I'm engaged in what will probably be a multi-decade work to translate his writings into English, so that the riches of his life's work can be available to others, not necessarily because they can't be improved on, but because if you stand on the shoulders of giants, you'll be able to reach taller. And we're all impoverished to the degree that we're not able to use some of those great sources like Ramirez and his works. So that's the background on Ramirez. I can talk about how I found Ramirez in its relationship to contemporary moral theology, but I'll pause there, Michael, if you want to jump in on any of
that. Two things. One's just a curiosity, but how many volumes is his complete works? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, so it's published in the old style. So let me see. It's 25, it's 12 volumes, but it's 25 individual books. So for example, he wrote a 2-volume, the first work in the collected works is given, Tomus 1, book 1. But it has 2 volumes, each is 500 pages. And it's called De Ipsa Philosophia, on philosophy itself. And it's an exhaustive treatment from a Thomistic perspective of what philosophy is, what its parts are, its methods, and all of that. But that's one work in the collected works. For example, then you have the De Analogia, which is 4 volumes, each is about 400 pages. That's considered volume 2. So it's 12 volumes, but when you add it all up, it's about 25 different books.
You and I have talked a lot about the distinction between propter quid and quia demonstrations, and you've really emphasized the importance and the significance of it, and that's been really beneficial for me getting to talk with you about that. With a propter quid demonstration, would you say that a propter quid demonstration, the reason it tells you why something is because you're able to answer why it is based on its essence or its nature? In other words, it's a necessary demonstration that it has to be this way because of knowing what it is? Or would you say it differently than that?
Yeah, I would say that's basically right. The difference between a propter quid and a quia demonstration has to do with the nature of the middle term in the demonstration. Both demonstrations are equally demonstrable. They're equally, the conclusion is equally certain, but it's a question of the content of the conclusion, what it is in the conclusion. So the propter quid demonstration, the middle term usually is the formal cause of the thing you're investigating. And so often it is the definition of the thing you're investigating. Whereas you can think about a propter quid demonstration and a quia demonstration in terms of going from a quia demonstration goes from effect back to its cause. So why is such and such the case? Well, it's because of this particular cause. So now we've proven that that it's a fact. And then the propter quid demonstration goes in reverse.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
It's more nuanced than that, but that's the basic gist, and that's essentially what that book I held up a minute ago from William Wallace's PhD dissertation, Moral Theology. It's asking the question in moral theology, what's the middle term for propter quid demonstrations in quia?
That also makes sense of the 5 ways, and you're working from effects back to cause, and all your existence, and
yeah.
One, so you were mentioning the couple of other things, kind of how you got into Ramirez and the relation to modern moral theology, and how attention to figures as significant as Ramirez has kind of been lost. So those 2 things, what's happened there, and then kind of how did you get into it?
Yeah, so my undergrad training is in philosophy and ethics, and that's why I was first introduced to St. Thomas just by accident, because I was combing the library looking for books on faith and reason so I could try to stay a Christian. And I found St. Thomas's treatment on the relationship between faith and reason, which, if you're interested, not you, Michael, I know you know about this, but the listener here, you can find in St. Thomas's treatment, Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1, chapters 3 and following, where he explains that relationship. And when I first read that, I felt like a bone sort of set in my brain, and something that always nagged me was finally resolved. And I kind of put St. Thomas aside after that. I felt like anything that St. Thomas said was true, that's going to be captured in modern works. And because there are all these other people who are doing all this work that, collectively, you put them all together, far more than I could ever do in a lifetime. So I'm not really going to read the old stuff anymore, because whatever's true in that will filter to the top, and other people will come to appreciate it, and it will be included in their contemporary works. That I found that was not true, but it took a long time to realize that. And basically, to take a long story and make it as short as I can, In contemporary analytical philosophy, ethics is, you have these different camps. You've got consequentialist ethics, you've got utilitarian ethics, you've got different types of obligation-based ethics, deontological ethics, and you have this this surging field. Maybe not so much surging anymore, but at the time it was, when I was in college, it was for sure virtue ethics. And when I started reading some of that material, I thought, this makes a lot of sense. Virtue ethics makes a lot of sense. The more I read some of that material, the more I felt like people were making stuff up. There didn't appear to be a kind of a solid grounding. And I felt like we can't be the only people who have asked these kinds of questions. There have to be other people before us who have asked these questions. And so in a similar way that one looks today and says, well, the scholarly consensus today is such and such, we also ought to have some humility and some interest in knowing, well, what is the consensus of the centuries on such and such a question, to the extent there is a consensus. And that's how I got into St. Thomas and the people who take themselves to be self-consciously his students in moral philosophy, moral theology. And as I did that, I came to see that one of my big sort of latent issues with contemporary moral discussion, people had already thought through it. People had already laid it bare. And that issue was, what is the relationship between the commandments, between obligations, and on the one hand, and happiness and virtue and charity on the other hand? And I felt like they were two different worlds that had to have some connection. But when I would read different works, it would often be the case that I would find one work emphasizing all the commands, all the obligations. And this is the majority, for example, it's the majority of Reformed and Lutheran ethics, is essentially it's centered around the 10 Commandments and the obligations that you have there to engage in certain conduct or to refrain from certain conduct. And a lot of it's true, a lot of it's helpful, but the central organizing part of the teaching is the commandments and its obligations. And in an analytic philosophy that's called divine command theory, where I have an obligation to do something because God commands it. And then when I read St. Thomas and other of his commentators or contemporary writers, they seldom talk like that. And so it took me a long time to figure out what's happening there.
Right.
And that's how I ended up getting into Ramirez, because it has to do, I got into Ramirez because I was reading some footnote of some book about how the older ways of doing ethics and moral theology, that I mean like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, both in the Catholic world and also in the Reformed and Lutheran worlds, had an extensive focus on obligations and commandments, and very little focus on things like charity and love. And the other, to be fair to those 17th, 18th century books, they did talk about, love, but they talked about it from the perspective of obligations that the love of God and neighbor impose on you. When I looked into these other works, I was looking for where's the treatment on suffering, and that's how that factors into the moral life. Where is the treatment of emotions, what we'd call emotions, what St. Thomas called the passions? Right. Very little, if any, discussion on any of those things, except from the perspective of things to avoid. And my reading of the scripture and the early church fathers and St. Thomas and the tradition, part of becoming more like Jesus is every part of you becomes more like Jesus, including your emotions. And it struck me as that there was an excessive focus on things to watch out for and be careful of and be wary of, which one should do all those things. But it struck me as there was an excessive focus on that. And I read a footnote one time, and a contemporary book trying to unpack St. Thomas's treatment of the emotions in the spiritual life and the moral life. And there was a footnote to Santiago Ramirez, J.M. Ramirez, De Passionibus Anime, on the passions of the soul. And so I looked that up, and it's a 650 page, it's part of the Opera Omnia. It's a 650 page work. I ordered it from Germany, and it came like a month later.
Just this is a curiosity, and perhaps I shouldn't ask it. How much did, I'm sure
like
there was
$100. It was like $100.
Yeah.
Or maybe a little
Right.
less, maybe 50, $75. It was expensive. And, you know, as you know, ordering books from overseas, a lot of the price is the shipping.
Right.
So here I held in my hand now this work that went into exhaustive detail of the emotions in the moral and spiritual life, and showing how, in St. Thomas's view of things, love, not commandments or obligations, but love is the central focus of the moral life,
Right.
not to the exclusion of commands or obligations, but as the primary part of the moral life. And so we could put it this way. So then I found another guy named Servais Pinckaers, whose great work, The Sources of Christian Ethics. People should pick this up. This tells it's a great, when he wrote this work, when he was the chair of moral theology at the University of Freiburg, which I mentioned earlier, it tells the story of the deformation of moral theology in the Christian world, and in the Catholic world, and the Reformed world, and the Lutheran world, this excessive focus on the primacy of obligations versus the primacy of love and virtue, again, not to the exclusion of those things. And he sums it up this way. He says, should we love out of obedience, or should we obey out of love? And
Right.
just that slight difference makes a huge difference in the way one presents this material, in the way one thinks about their own moral life and their relationship with God and others. So I found Ramirez through a footnote in some contemporary book on emotions in the moral life, and that's what cracked open the world of Santiago Ramirez. And I realized, you know, what I had thought foolishly as a college kid, I don't really need to read old stuff because to the extent there's anything good in it, contemporary writers will pick it up. I was wrong on that, and so that's how I got into Ramirez. And Ramirez and Servais Pinckaers, which are interesting a pairing for those who are aware of Pinckaers, because and I can speak more on that in a second, and how what they teach on the current state of things in the moral theology, and how it matters for the average person. To me, that's the big deal. How it matters for the average person. To me, the issue here is not so much the academic disputes; it's how does this matter for my life? But I'll pause there, Michael, if you want to jump in.
Well, I think some of my questions are connected to that. As you were talking about it, one of the things that I was thinking about was the relation to happiness and virtue being ordered toward an end, and us, the virtuous life, being a happy life. So we act with justice, fortitude, temperance, and prudence, the cardinal virtues, because that's the end towards which we're ordered. Is happy. Our happiness is attained through virtue, not despite it, but through it. And then particularly faith, hope, and love, the supernatural end toward which we're ordered. So one question I have is any thoughts related to virtue and the end, and how happiness fits in there? And this is just a guess. I'm guessing that is connected with some of your thoughts about how it relates to the average layman who doesn't have time to spend a lot of time studying theology. But if there, I'm sure there's more you also wanted to say. So yeah, that I think it's a great segue to that.
Yeah. So the average person, I think, in the pew thinks of the moral life as a series of do's and don'ts. They think of the moral life as a set of commandments, and you live a good life to the extent you check more of those boxes versus you don't.
Right.
And the way you can conceive of these, there's what you end up with is two separate views of what the moral life is. And by the moral life, I don't mean like the life of being a good person, although that's true. I mean the point of being on earth.
Right.
Who's a really good person? How do you become a really good person? Who's really well off? Why are they really well off? Like those kinds of existential questions that most people ask in some way, one or more times in their life. And there's two different sets of answers to that. And it goes back even, you can have the morality of obligation or the morality of happiness. And this goes back even into like Plato, Socrates days. One of Plato's works, Glaucon, he has this dialogue with Socrates and this guy Glaucon about why people do the right thing. And Glaucon believes that people do the right thing because go ahead.
Could we pause just one moment?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
We've got so some of our readers with kids, and I know Brian gets my challenges here, but I'm trying to keep kids from, stay downstairs, trying to keep kids from getting into the discussion and hearing parts of the discussion that their ears aren't ready to hear as well. So
you had to change seats because of the Glaucon conversation.
Do what?
You had to change seats because of Glaucon.
Yeah, right. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
So Glaucon says people do the right thing because they're afraid if they don't do the right thing, then someone else will do, the wrong thing to them too. And so you're faithful to your spouse because you're afraid if you don't, your spouse will be unfaithful to you. And he tells the story called the Ring of Gyges, where this poor shepherd finds a magical ring that turns him invisible at will. And then how now he's able to do whatever he wants and how it corrupts him. And he kills the king, seduces the queen, and takes over the kingdom. And Glaucon says everyone who had such a ring would do those things. And Socrates responds, no, I don't think that's the way it is. I think that doing the right thing just is the good life. Glaucon, you seem to think that you either do the good thing and sacrifice a little bit of happiness, or you do the wrong thing and you get some more happiness. And I would say that the majority of people today, maybe not the majority, that's anecdotal, a lot of people today have that view of the moral life. A lot of people sitting in the pews at various churches, they have that view of the moral life, that I either try to be a really good person by doing the do's and not doing the don'ts, and I'm going to have to sacrifice some happiness to do that. That's just not the tradition that comes from St. Thomas or from Jesus himself in the Gospels.
Right.
And Servais Pinckaers tells that story. So the morality of happiness just is the biblical patristic and scholastic sort of heritage coming from St. Thomas. And this morality of obligation is a twisted, shriveled, I would say dangerous and depressing perspective on one's life that, and we can tell this story in future conversations, that comes directly from the nominalist school of philosophy that came shortly after St. Thomas. And people would be shocked, I think, to see, how the kind of nominalistic, that's just bad philosophy, bad theology, seeds that they have in their own mind, they didn't consciously adopt, they just find themselves with it. And so you have these two different, schools. And what Servais Pinckaers tells in his book that I held up earlier, Sources of Christian Ethics, he tells the story, the history there, and how that nominalist understanding of putting pride in place, and changing understanding of the will, whereas St. Thomas teaches that the will is like what I call a good-seeking missile. It is oriented toward the good. Anything that the mind presents to it as good, the will wants it. This is why we want to possess the good. This is why little kids, take a marble and put it in their pocket, or God forbid, shove it up their nose, because they want to possess the good. They want to keep it. They want it for themselves. And it's because the will is a good seeking missile. But Occam and those who followed in his kind of school said, no, the will is not. It's indifferent. And this tiny little change led to a bunch of other changes downstream that led to an excessive focus on obligation and so on. And that entered into, as I said a second ago, Catholic moral theology and Protestant moral theology, where they had major consequences for the way that moral theology was presented. For example, if you look at Aristotle, the way he spoke about moral philosophy in the Nicomachean Ethics, there's multiple chapters on friendship. And St. Thomas also speaks about the importance of friendship. You won't find friendship in majority of treatments of moral theology in those strains that I described a second ago. Just not there. Because it's purely voluntary. Friendships are voluntary. They're not obligatory. Now, you may have obligations to a friend that are right, and then we'll talk about that. But you don't talk about the good of friendship. Another thing that they don't talk about is suffering. They'll talk about suffering from the perspective of things that you have to avoid so that you don't sin in your suffering. But they don't speak about suffering as part of the moral life, as part of something that is refining. They leave that to a different discipline, ascetical theology or spiritual theology. It's not considered part of moral theology, something else. Because again, the organizing principle was obligation as opposed to happiness. And there are many other kind of downstream consequences, but you see that all through those centuries. And this is ultimately how I got further into Ramirez, because I realized here's a guy who, and if you read anything about him, there's not much on him on the internet right now. He was a very hard-headed Thomist. He was not interested in engaging in the contemporary scholarship sort of scene. He was interested in being a master of St. Thomas's perspective on things. And so, for example, Servais Pinckaers, one of the things he criticizes, even a significant part of his own tradition, he's a Dominican, he criticizes them for unintentionally falling into some of this nominalistic voluntarism, obligation-oriented, approach to moral life. And specifically, he criticizes them many of them for failing to see how central to St. Thomas the question of our ultimate happiness is. And that's why St. Thomas begins with happiness, and also failing to see how central charity is. Well, as I read Ramirez, he gets that. His view of the moral life, it's just that. It's the opposite of what Servais Pinckaers is criticizing. And in other words, it's exactly what Servais Pinckaers says it ought to be.
Right.
And yet, in this great book, which I hope everyone gets and reads, there's not a single reference to Ramirez. The bibliography doesn't reference anything from Ramirez. It's very strange. And as the best I can make of that is that when Ramirez's works were being published in the early 70s, this book was being written basically around that same time. The book was published in 85. Seems like enough time to get to know that material, especially since Ramirez wrote all that stuff while he was a professor at Freiburg, and then he did that here. So that's the gist. And that's why I got into Ramirez, and a lot more to say about Ramirez, a lot more to say about this story.
I think that would be, if it's okay, that would be a phenomenal spot for us to segue for our the next video we do. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, it does. Let me give one caveat, and that is that so that what we've said so far isn't misunderstood. There has been a reaction in post-Vatican II. There's been a reaction to that excessive focus on obligation, and that reaction has gone to an equal and opposite extreme. So that there's now a suspicion of authority, and there's now a suspicion of obligation, and that's not what Ramirez is advocating. It's not what Pinckaers is advocating. It's not what I'm saying is laudable. The point is not one shouldn't care about obligations. One shouldn't care about commandments. The question is, which is primary?
Right.
Happiness and charity, or obligation and avoiding individual sin. And the way I think about it is like, you can think about the moral life from the perspective of commandments. Are they the ladder that you climb? You're following the commandments, or are they the guardrails on the road that keep you from falling off the side of the road? And then in order to stay on the road and move down the road, that's what's required: virtue, charity, grace,
Yeah.
and all the rest. So they're guardrails, they're not rungs.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy, really well put. I was thinking of the phrase that charity thrusting you forward in your love for God and in your love for, in your love for neighbor to do good.
Yeah,
That's beautiful, and it's fun because we've talked about this a lot, but I feel like I've learned even more just through this conversation, and so I'm grateful for it, and I'm excited about the next video. Just to tell everyone what we're going to be doing is we'll continue this conversation, and we're going to be producing weekly videos where we're talking about theological topics. And we'll, I suspect, be on moral theology for a while. There's a lot to draw from here, and then we'll kind of let y'all know what we're thinking in upcoming videos. But this has been fun. So thank you, Ryan. I'm grateful for your friendship and all of your study in this. So
awesome. Thanks, Michael.